afternoon, Happy New Year, and welcome to our very first show of 2021. I'm Melissa Ridgen. So last year marked some huge stories with regards to harvesting rights, from lobster to moose to salmon, some big headline-grabbing stories. Today we are putting harvesting rights in focus. With all that happened last year, what is in store for this year? So September, of course, you'll remember Spaganagity First Nation launched their first moderate livelihood fishery in Nova Scotia. You will recall it was not well received by commercial fishermen and local communities. Violence, theft, vandalism, arson all plagued the First Nation fishers who were exercising their treaty right. We discussed at length here on InFocus that whole issue. Let's take a look back at some of that discussion.
I'm emotionally drained.
That is Jason Maher and his daughter, Jaslyn Paul, emotional after a month of violence. Late Friday night, the lobster pound in Pubnico burnt to the ground. Police report the person of interest is in hospital with life-threatening injuries. It is one of 2 pounds that a mob of over 200 people surrounded. They broke in, stole, and destroyed lobster, which is Sabaganagity's moderate livelihood fishery. Maher was barricaded inside. He live-streamed the event.
They've destroyed my van. There's a couple hundred of them out there. And I refuse to leave. I'm not leaving. They said they won't let me leave unless they have my lobsters.
The violence has not stopped. Maher is getting threats.
He hated me. I asked him why. He said, "'Cause you're an Indian." And I hate Indians. I gave the text. He texted that to me, and I gave it to the RCMP last night.
Sabaganagity community members have faced violence, harassment by commercial fishermen since the moderate livelihood fishery was launched a month ago. The commercial fishermen say lobster stocks are low, putting the fishery at risk. They say it's not about racism. Chief Mike Sack was assaulted last week and a van was set on fire. 2 people have since been charged for each incident. The Mi'kmaq lobster harvesters say they will continue to fish. Angel Moore, APTN National News, Tubuktuk, Halifax.
Julene Maher is a fisher from the Spaganagity First Nation. She is the sister of a man who last week was trapped in by a violent mob in that lobster facility that we just saw in New Edinburgh last week. That same facility, of course, was burned to the ground on the weekend, as we saw. We caught up with Julene on the Saulnerville Wharf yesterday. It's in the heart of where all of this is going on in St. Mary's Bay in Nova Scotia. Julene, how are the Mi'kmaq doing there? Have things settled down since the weekend?
Since there's been more police presence, it's been quiet. We've had the odd few that came through and had their opinions, but it hasn't been as it was before. We're still losing gear daily out in the bay. Other than that, it's been a really good, welcoming education kind of spot for the last week.
So I wanted to ask you a couple of questions, just for those of us who are not in the region, have not paid attention to what's going on in terms of the lobster fishing there. I think everybody understands that this is a treaty right, that this has been upheld by the Supreme Court. What people seem to be confused of is that there isn't a definition surrounding what is a moderate livelihood fishery. Can you explain to us, what do the Mi'kmaq feel that is a moderate livelihood? Is it a certain number of lobsters? Is it a certain annual wage?
Not any one person can define a moderate livelihood. I feel a moderate livelihood is different for each person. We are all treaty rights holders. So myself, I have 5 children at home, so I believe my moderate livelihood would be a little bit different than somebody who is maybe a single person or a couple with one child. Their moderate livelihood would be probably a bit different than my own. This is what we've been waiting for the past 21 years, is for it to be defined for everybody's understanding, for everybody's well-being. I can't defy that, just like I said, as we have to do this as a collective nation, and we all need to sit down and let the government know that this is what we would like. It's unfair to our people that we have been waiting 21 years for this. And this is what it's brought us to, all this animosity, and it's all the government's fault. The government has left us in limbo for far too long. So it's finally come to this, and now we need to sit down and put things out there and start asserting our treaty right even more.
What should have happened in the past 20 years since the Marshall decision that would have prevented this conflict that we're seeing now, right?
Well, you know, Canada, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, never addressed, they've never fully implemented the Marshall decision. They haven't addressed the big question, which is, you know, what is a moderate livelihood and what do treaty rights look like when they're implemented today? The commercial, communal commercial licenses, you know, that was the response from Canada to the Marshall decision 21 years ago, right, to slide the Mi'kmaq into the existing, you know, commercial fishery. But that's not the treaty right. And to make that clear, and I've said this before, if Donald Marshall Jr. was alive, or anyone who fishes the same way he did, because he caught and sold eels, asserting his treaty right, out of the DFO-regulated season, and without a DFO license, he was charged with illegal fishing. And over the last 21 years, and you see it today still, anyone who fishes the same way that Donald Marshall Jr. did gets their gear seized by DFO. Or faces charges for illegal fishing. So you can see the decision hasn't been implemented. Like the commercial access is successful, but it's not addressing the treaty right. The language is there, right? Nation to nation reconciliation that they're working on you know, negotiating a path forward. But at the same time, conservation officers, because Sabaganagati is not the only ban. There's Eskasoni and Baudeladeque, and other bans are starting moderate livelihood fisheries. Yeah. But Eskasoni and Baudeladeque and Cape Breton are doing it now, and they're getting their traps seized by DFO out of the water.
Literally today, like just happening today, right?
Right now. And so you have the minister saying, on the one hand, all this great language, and then on the other hand, the conservation officers and enforcement officers out on the water seizing traps. So the actions don't match the words. And that's a problem. It's been a problem for 21 years, and it's a problem today.
So first things first, I want to throw out there, the commercial fishers have been saying through all of this is not about racism, that they respect the Mi'kmaq right to a moderate livelihood. Their concern is that the Mi'kmaq are fishing out of season, and B, that they're depleting shrinking lobster stocks. I'm going to start with a visual that's been widely shared all over social media that shows the size of the Sabaganagati fishery compared to the other commercial lobster fishing that happens in this region. Megan, I was fascinated by what, when we had spoke last week about what in season is all about. Can you share with us what's in season?
Sure, yeah. I mean, in Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada generally, we've mostly chosen our seasons for economic reasons, in part so that different regions around the Maritimes can be part of providing the supply of hard-shelled lobsters. That's a more lucrative market, it's worth more. So that's what we've prioritized here. So the openings and closings when LFA 34, for example, which is where St. Mary's Bay is, when that closes in May, LFA 27 up in Cape Breton opens, and that's open from May to July. So we have these openings and closings in many regards, specifically to be able to provide a year-round supply of hard-shelled lobsters.
So it's not based on if you're fishing, well, I guess there's the soft-shelled lobsters, they are mating and they're molting, and so there's that. So if you're fishing those right now, does that mean that there is going to be some catastrophic effect on lobster numbers?
I mean, I think scale is really important here, right? So when we look to Maine, we know that Maine has a year-round fishery for lobster. So they catch them all summer. There's a soft-shell lobster market. Canada buys soft-shell lobster as well. So you can fish lobsters in the summer. There's no reason that you cannot fish them. But you have to take into account the scale of that fishery and the mortality on the lobster at a different time in their life cycle. But there's nothing inherently unsustainable about fishing in the summer.
Okay. Fred, I want to go to you. Let's talk about lobster numbers. Are you concerned with dwindling lobster stocks in the area that is being contested right now by the commercial fishers, saying that this the Mi'kmaq moderate livelihood fishery is going to have a catastrophic impact on the lobster in that area?
Complex question. Depending on the time scale on which you're looking at things, right now Nova Scotia is doing much better than it ever did before, and this is in part a function of conditions are improving here. And so lobster production in Nova Scotia is skyrocketing, and everybody's been doing better. But if you go back to about 2016 down in the St. Mary's Bay area, and you compare the landings to 2 years later, yeah, there was a dip down there. And people are concerned about lobster numbers whenever they go down because it has direct impact on the fisheries.
So, and I wanted to, that brings me to my next question, which is about, because we have heard that, and the stats are that there was, the numbers have dropped consistently over, I believe it to be 3 years. Megan, when we had a conversation, you had explained that that's kind of, it might be accurate, but there's a bigger picture around that too. If you look at the 17-year average.
So the graph is what we call catch per unit effort. So this is basically a relative abundance measurement that we can kind of monitor. So all it is the total amount of commercial lobster catch divided by the total number of individual vessels that are fishing within that lobster fishing area. So what we see between 2002 and 2018 is this up and down, right? There's a lot of variability. Mm-hmm. So the fish harvesters are upset that catches have gone down in the last couple of years. Yes, absolutely they have, but they were at a record high before that, right? And so this variability, when we look at that trend, there's nothing worrying about that. And so we don't generally look to catches as a very good measurement of abundance. We really want to see what are we catching for the amount of effort we're putting in and looking over time again. So it's not just 1 year. We don't manage a fishery kind of year to year like that. It's really over time.
Fred, you have growing up and spending most of your life in Atlantic Canada. You, I thought, had a really interesting perspective on lobster fishers in general. Like this is, that they are usually multi-generational, that they fish very specific territories that are handed down generation to generation. Can you share a little bit of that with our audience, just some of that background?
Sure. So if we go back to the beginning of all this, the Fisheries Act stipulated back 100 years ago nearly that DFO was supposed to extract the maximum value out of its resources. So in the management schemes that developed for lobster, they sort of upped the licenses to the point that they thought the resource could bear and would pull every lobster out of it that was possible. They then began to put these licenses out by district, and Megan described those a little bit earlier, and there's a certain number of people that can fish in each area. But these districts are large and people come out of small ports. And what has happened over time is historic and individual territories have developed, frequently passed down from family to family. And they develop by people basically putting their sharp elbows out there and elbowing other people out of the way. And you get to a point that a community will have established a number of people that can fish in a particular area, and the newcomer that comes into that area is met with a frosty reception. And sometimes this can actually trigger major violence. There have been a number of incidents, the most recent of which was one called for an individual named Philip Boudreau, who was killed up in Cape Breton over a dispute over lobsters up in those areas. So these communities have got that particular territoriality, and it's driven in part because this is a tough life.
Still gets me that non-Indigenous commercial fishers would feel that this is their territory in particular, and couldn't understand why the Mi'kmaq also would think that. Joining me now is APTN's Atlantic Bureau video journalist Angel Moore. She's the reporter who brought you that daily coverage of all of that turmoil last fall. Angel, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm so happy to see your smiling face. Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you too, Melissa.
So did you think that lobster was going to be such a huge part of your 2020?
Well, it was before, but no, I did not think September and October, those months would be as big as they were.
Well, actually. Sorry, yeah, I was just going to say that it's, I don't think any of us out this way definitely didn't see it coming. So I was wondering, if this, maybe we should have seen it coming. Maybe the people that are in the region saw it bubbling up to this.
Yeah, it was quite large when Savaganagity released their moderate livelihood management plan in September. And of course, you know, that's when it hit the news, and that's when all the violence was seen. But really, this has been going on since the Marshall decision for 21 years, 22 years. The Mi'kmaq have been telling me that they've been having problems fishing lobster, exercising their treaty rights every year, every time. So to them, when I was down there, they told me that this is not new, that these conflicts and aggressions from non-Indigenous fishers have really been going on for over 20 years. So to the Mi'kmaq, it's not new, but to the rest of the country, it's new, and it was brought to light because of the Moderate Livelihood Management Plan.
I have to ask you, how was it on the ground covering this? I mean, that was a crazy couple of months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was all kinds of emotions. You know, at the beginning, when the livelihood was launched in September, people were very happy, very proud. It was historic, and you know, I knew it was historic because they were exercising their treaty rights officially. The Mi'kmaq have been trying to develop a moderate livelihood plan since the Donald Marshall decision, and you know, working with DFO for over 20 years and getting nowhere. So finally, they were fed up and just launched their own plan and did it. But really, Mi'kmaq fishers have been fishing their treaty rights. They don't call it moderate livelihood fishing. Mm-hmm. They call it treaty fishing all this time. So it was an array of emotions, excitement, and then it quickly turned to fear and you know, violence and fear, really, but determination. No matter what happened, no matter how bad things got, the fishers went out fishing every day, no matter what.
So there was kind of a bombshell within the bombshell of all of this was in the midst of this turmoil, then suddenly the Mi'kmaq buy Clearwater Foods, mm-hmm. which is like the biggest lobster producer, supplier in Canada. You know, on one hand, people saw, like a lot of people saw this as a huge coup, like, you know, what a total slap in the face to the commercial fishing industry is to say, like, now the biggest guys on campus are in fact Mi'kmaq. But then on the flip side, mm-hmm. you know, people were saying, well, this kind of flies in the face of our traditional beliefs in harvesting. It's too much. It's not sustainable necessarily. So what are some of the things that you're hearing from people on the ground there with regards to that massive purchase?
Well, actually, the Clearwater purchase is the commercial fishing, and people see that extremely and very separate as the moderate livelihood fishing, as people see treaty fishing as separate as the moderate livelihood fishing. There's different types of fishing. The Clearwater was purchased by the Mi'kmaq chiefs, led by Chief Terry Paul of Membertou, mm-hmm. And a community from Newfoundland, and also Savaganagity. But the chiefs, that was the chiefs' deal that bought that company. And I know people are saying, you know, well, you know, they're doing the moderate livelihood, and then they bought this big corporation. Mm-hmm. But really, it is seen as completely separate entities, so to speak. There's been a lot of jokes, you know, that, okay, now the non-Indigenous fishers work for the Mi'kmaq. But I know there's been press releases from Membertou that they plan to carry on. They have contracts and, you know, corporate obligations that they're going to carry on business as usual and try to enhance the Mi'kmaq commercial fishery. But I guess to me, and what I've learned mostly is that there's the different types of fishings mm-hmm. are very different, you know, and even some see the moderate livelihood fishing as not traditional, but others do see it as traditional. Some see treaty fishing more as traditional, and they're not interested in the moderate livelihood fishing at all because, you know, that's regulated by the DFO. Mm-hmm. So it's very complicated, and I'm still learning, and there's a lot of passion involved, and I think a lot of the fear and the anger was from people not knowing and not being educated about the treaties, and that's really, I think, what it stems down to is education and Mi'kmaq tradition, Mi'kmaq nationhood, which is different from across the country with other treaties. So it's quite a learning experience, but I just want to say that it's historic. It's historic for everyone across the country that the Mi'kmaq are asserting their treaty rights, and it's not just fishing. Also, Swaganagity is talking about forestry. Other communities are talking about forestry. It's all resources, not just lobster. So that I think we're living in very exciting times, and the immediate future is going to be quite exciting.
I was just going to say, well, we've got lots to watch for here in 2021. Angel, thank you so much for joining us. We have to take a break. When we come back, we're moving to Algonquin territory, a fight over moose. Stay with us. Oh my God. Welcome back to Quebec now, where a battle wages over moose. On one side, the Algonquin wanting a 5-year ban on hunting moose, as they say the population's on the brink of decimation. Amnesty International backs this call, says Canada needs to protect the moose for the Algonquin. On the other side, non-Indigenous hunters who say that they're entitled to their moose too. Here's our Quebec reporter Lindsey Richardson with a bit more.
A moose is not just something that we hunt, it's a ceremony for us. It's something that we do because that's, as an Anishinaabe people, that's who we are.
It's like something really spiritual. I've learned that from my parents and my grandparents, and it's just like important to share for everyone else to know.
So this is why we're here today. We're shutting it down because we're saying no more. You may not want to listen to us, but now you have no choice.
Some people actually leave the meat there and just bring the antlers and bring the hide. Our people don't do that. Our people need that resource. We need that to eat.
They're coming in all directions right now. So I would expect that this gets resolved in a timely manner. Because this is a very dangerous, escalating situation.
Everybody thinks it's the natives that are blocking the road.
It's something that's not taken very lightly by our people. We want to work with the government, first of all, to come up with a plan, but we can't be have our foot on the gas pedal going towards a brick wall.
Nestled deep within one of the richest wildlife reserves in Quebec is the Algonquin territory of Barrier Lake. It's small, population about 700. There are no stores here. Many choose to live off the land. A trip for supplies requires 2 hours travel in either direction.
It's too far, to try and live on other sources of meat.
Barrier Lake Chief Casey Ratt says wild game once thrived here, but in just 10 years, the moose population plummeted by 35%. Quebec opted to issue fewer tags to hunters in 2020, saying a moratorium is, quote, by no means considered. Minister Pierre Dufour says current numbers are concerning, but not critical.
Especially around this time, they kill, between 90 and 116 in 1 month. Meanwhile, my community will harvest 1 or 2 or 3 moose in this time.
Elder Linda Thomas says the moose were given to people by the Creator, and for them, the animal represents food sovereignty. The collective of Algonquin communities agree. Without a 5-year pause on sport hunting, the moose will disappear.
It was a mutual agreement between the moose and the Anishinaabe and the Algonquin people. And right now, we still respect that. But other groups, unfortunately, Quebec and CPAC do not have that same respect for the moose and the wildlife.
White Duck says one hunting outfitter is already taking the Algonquin Nation to court over their decision to block access to trails leading into the bush. 9 camps are now spread out along the stretch of Highway 117, monitored by police. The camps themselves are peaceful. Children play here. Adults sit by the fire, drinking coffee.
It's still crooked.
Some finish crafts.
I tan moose hides. I teach the kids how to tan. It's very important to pass on the traditional knowledge on that.
But they're here to keep hunters out. And in the last few weeks, they've been facing more resistance. One woman rammed a demonstrator with her car. Another man threw a moose leg. As a pressure tactic, they blocked the highway for 2.5 hours. They're reportedly taking boats and planes to access the hunting grounds. But mainstream media focuses on one thing: Indigenous rage.
They should show the whole story and not just clips or something that perceives to make First Nations people look aggressive or whatnot. They should tell the whole story, what's behind it. You know, there's reasons why our people react the way they do.
Corey Jerome is one of the many demonstrators who's been logging the events on the ground through his own videos, including one incident where a forest ranger was allegedly caught filming the camps from a ditch.
You were hiding right there, you watch a little girl piss.
That's perverted!
It's a stream, please. They're doing this, that just to make us mad. And it's just going to get worse before it gets better.
Provincial police would not confirm whether charges were laid in any of the above incidents, only that a few minor incidents were looked into. CPAC said the forest rangers patrolling the wildlife reserve have shown exemplary professionalism and have avoided confrontation with demonstrators. Intimidation continues. When a moose leg again was thrown at one of the camps, they made the best of it.
Not sure, I didn't ask him.
The leg itself is roasted, marrow eaten, tendons, hooves, and hide all used. Nothing this precious goes to waste.
I don't like to say it this way, but you know, this is their grocery store. This is how they live. This is how we've always lived. And that's just non-native hunters, that's what they don't understand. They think we hunt and hunt for sport just to fill up our freezers. We take what we need.
They drive the roads with antlers on their truck to represent their value of the antlers. Not the meat, just the antlers. And do you eat antlers?
Amnesty International doesn't mince words. They say this is a human rights issue, and in a letter call on the feds to intervene. Quote, it's clear provincial and federal ministers need to firmly defend the role of Indigenous people in decision-making that concerns them. They also need to lend support to Indigenous peoples when they're confronted with negative reactions. Amnesty says the Algonquin Nation's actions prove they are leaders in conservation. Letters of support from other First Nations and provincial party leaders say the same. With weeks left in hunting season, there's risk of more confrontation. But Charles Ratt says if nothing is done, the reserve's ecology could be changed forever.
You could go in any direction and identify how it would affect. You know, it would affect, of course, our people. It would affect the predators. Therefore, it would affect the smaller animals as well. You know, right down all the way down the line of the ecosystem. You know, right to the vegetation and everything else.
For now, the government is offering to reimburse hunters who bought tags for La Vérendrye and who've not been able to access the bush. But the Algonquin Nation says the camps are not coming down without a workable plan to ensure moose numbers go up. Lindsey Richardson, APTN National News, Barrier Lake, Quebec.
Joining me now is that reporter who brought us that story, Lindsey Richardson from our Montreal bureau. Lindsey, thanks for joining us. You are such a gifted storyteller. I watch your stuff so often and think, wow, that's incredible work you do. Can you share with us, what's sort of happened since you did that story? Where are the tensions at now? Any new developments?
Well, it's sort of an interesting idea, Melissa, this word tension. As you just heard in the previous story and in follow-ups that we've done since, this issue of moose hunting is incredibly divisive, it's polarizing, and it really comes down to survival hunting and subsistence hunting, to bragging rights and trophy hunting from Quebec hunters. So in that sense, the issue still remains. The tension is still there. There has not been any agreement between parties, since the camps came down. A judge did hand down an injunction order later on in the season, so the barricades were lifted peacefully. As far as we know, there hasn't been any fallout from that actual injunction order, but Quebec is committing now moving forward to having better discussions with the Algonquin Nation. They've even appointed a negotiator. That was an announcement made in mid-November. But a first meeting between parties where Quebec reportedly tabled a tentative management plan for the moose population didn't really go anywhere. The plan was deemed to be insufficient. We don't have the details. We don't know exactly what they were suggesting, but in this entire process, the Algonquin Nation is reiterating the same point, which is a moose moratorium, a complete pause on hunting, is the only viable solution to get the population numbers up. They were already deemed to be concerning last year, not critical in the eyes of the government, but the situation only stands to get worse if we keep exploiting the populations on the ground. That's what the Algonquin Nation is saying. But Melissa, one thing does have to be added here and that's the issue is about moose. That is, they are the biggest game that's hunted in the La Vérendrye Nature Reserve, but the issues itself are more expansive than that. Overhunting is an issue in all species. We heard from hunters that say they're finding partridge carcasses in the forest with their chests ripped out, animals are being hunted without that fundamental respect that many First Nations, practice when they hunt. And deforestation is also an issue. Replanting of monoculture that's threatening this ecological balance and other species. And of course, at the root of it, like we saw with the Wet'suwet'en protests, like we saw with the lobster fishery protests in Caledonia, racism and harassment. And this take-all attitude is persistent, and wherever the discussions go, it's hard to say whether or not that particular issue will ever really, be solved.
Yeah, if we can solve the racism issue today in this discussion, wow, we would be getting an award of some sort. I know that the Algonquin had said that there's a little bit more hope, I guess, with this new Indigenous Affairs Minister in Lafreniere, who some feel that there's some hope that he'll handle the situation better. Where's that hope coming from? What's that all about?
Well, first of all, in the 2 years when Sylvie Damour, Yann Lafreniere's predecessor, were in office, the consensus seemed to be that discussions on a number of issues went nowhere. Different speculation as to why this was. Some people believe that because she doesn't have a strong grip of English, that might have been affecting communication with communities, a lot of them who do speak English. But with Yann Lafreniere, when he was appointed, there was clearly a little bit of hesitation. He's got a military background. He's former head of communications for the Montreal Police. And a big part of his portfolio as Indigenous Affairs Minister is overseeing follow-through on a report that's completely critical of police. So understandably, there was some hesitation, but we have to give credit where credit is due, and Lafreniere did commit to making a week-by-week announcement, a plan called I Hope, J'ai Espoir, that he introduced, and he was consistent with those announcements. So in 2021, Quebec can expect to see things like increased cultural sensitivity training, training for navigators in the health system, more resources for policing, and one of the announcements that was made was a political roundtable with the Assembly of First Nations Quebec Labrador and the Premier, who doesn't usually sit in on these discussions. So he seems to be open, he seems to know communications and have a strategy, so there is another meeting upcoming, several more at this rate, and but the feedback that we've been getting, that we've been hearing from leaders, is that out of very foundation, they feel that they can at least express their concerns and that there is somebody on the other end who is willing to listen.
Well, I love that. So there is lots that we will be watching for too, obviously, in 2021. I look forward to your continued coverage of this. Thanks so much, Lindsey, for joining us. We have to take another break. This show is flying by. When we come back, a huge Christmas surprise for BC First Nations fighting for decades to save wild salmon. Stay with us. Welcome back. Well, days before Christmas, the federal government announced that salmon farms operating off BC's west coast would be phased out. It was a huge surprise to many because just months earlier, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans basically said that these salmon farms were fine. They're not impacting wild salmon stocks, as First Nations had been arguing was the case for decades. So we chatted about this very matter earlier on InFocus before the Christmas break. Let's take a look.
BC's fish farming industry has divided scientists, governments, and First Nations up and down the coast for the last 30 years.
Make no mistake, we're not going to stop until the fish farms are out.
Many believe the industry is an ecological disaster waiting to happen. A breeding ground for disease that has decimated the surrounding environment and wildlife, namely Pacific salmon. While others see the farms as an essential part of the provincial economy, one that provides steady jobs and meets a growing demand for fresh seafood. With battle lines being drawn across the province, striking a balance between economic prosperity, environmental protection, and Indigenous sovereignty has become critical.
So for those of you not on the West Coast, this all might be news to you as well, that this fight about salmon has been going on for decades, heating up in recent years with the arrival of these foreign-owned fish farms operating in the open water of the coast. More than 100 First Nations and various environmental groups have called for the government to remove fish farming from the Discovery Islands off BC's West Coast. They say the Fraser salmon fishery has collapsed and the fish farms are partly to blame. Here's a look at a piece by APTN's Tina House.
Back in 2009, the Cohen Commission was created to look at the decline in salmon on the Fraser River. $25 million was spent on the inquiry, and it provided a series of recommendations. Number 19 of those recommendations was that if fish farms disrupted the Fraser River salmon in any way, they must be closed by September 30th, 2020. And with that deadline looming, everyone here says the time to act is now. Chief Wayne Sparrow of Musqueam on the Fraser River says his community hasn't been able to fish in 2 years.
It's industry that's driving it, and we have to pull together as First Nations, to use our powers that we have and the legal mechanism that we have to try to get them out. Like I said, we were a fool for a while until it got brought to our attention by my cousin Mike Sparrow that the fish farm recommendations weren't being followed. So we had a few commission meetings to talk about it, thinking that those recommendations were going to be adhered to, and then finding out. So now we're into the fight now, and we're not going to give up the fight.
If I was able to talk to Prime Minister Trudeau and Minister Jordan right now, I would ask him, who are you listening to in terms of fish farms, in terms of implementing Cohen Recommendation 19, in terms of actioning the transition of fish farms to open net cage, from open net cage to land-based closed containment.
Tina House, APTN National News, North Vancouver.
Joining us now is Bob Chamberlain. He's a grassroots longtime salmon warrior himself. He's Kwakwaka'wakw and knows the salmon issue inside and out, backwards and forwards. And Alexander Morton is a biologist who has worked closely with First Nations in their fight for healthy salmon stocks in coastal and inland BC. Thank you guys both for joining us. So, Bob, for our eastern and central or our northern viewers who may not know, give us an idea of what salmon mean to nations in BC.
When you consider salmon across British Columbia for First Nations, we're talking about one of the primary staple foods and sources of protein. We've always relied upon this resource and managed it in a very good manner up until DFO decided to step up and do what's best, which is essentially marshal the salmon runs of British Columbia down the road of extinction.
Are there parallels between what you're seeing with the Mi'kmaq on the East Coast with their fight and the fight that you guys have been having about salmon on the West Coast?
Well, without a question, we have the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, through implementation of regulation and policy, absolutely recharacterizing Supreme Court of Canada law. And when we consider that as a democracy, that is should be a red flag for all Canadians. But this is no surprise to any First Nation across Canada, where the department has steadfastly refused to embrace Supreme Court rulings in the broadest sense. And in response, they take the narrowest possible view, which puts our salmon at risk, but it also then diminishes the human rights of First Nations people in this country.
So you said the role of the GFO in all of this, they seem to just, do what they want. Is the problem really with DFO, or is it with the politicians who direct them?
I would say that both. I would say that the problem inside DFO is that the environment is one that is hell-bent on supporting of fish farms. Now, the Cohen Commission was in response to a very, very low return of sockeye salmon to the Fraser. And here we are 8 years later, where we've had 2 successive runs that are even lower than what triggered the Cohen Commission examination. And we still have the department perpetuating support for fish farms, creating science that supports that, and moves completely away and absolutely abandon the precautionary principle in terms of their primary responsibility to the environments and wild fisheries.
Alexander, I was shocked, and I'm not a fisheries expert by any stretch here, but I was shocked to learn in researching this that the fish that are farmed in the Pacific Ocean are in fact Atlantic salmon. You're a biologist. Can you explain why? And who would think that it was a good idea to do this? Like, it seems to me that that would be introducing an invasive species, and that could have some problems.
You are absolutely right. They are an invasive species, and they have brought their own viruses with them, particularly Piscine orthoreovirus. The reason we have Atlantic salmon is all of the salmon farmers operating in the ocean in British Columbia are from outside British Columbia. Most of them are Norwegian, and they brought their livestock with them, similar to the European cow farmers brought their livestock from Europe. So the Atlantics grow fast, get fat easily in the pens, whereas Pacific salmon just didn't adapt as well to that.
I want to watch a clip here. This is another clip from Salmon Warriors, that documentary done by our friends over at APTN Investigates. Let's take a look.
What's happened here over the years is there been sick fish have been coming into our mainland and killing our regular runs. The fish farms have viruses and sea lice and all kinds of diseases that have been emptying out our rivers.
So if I'm to understand that, it's not just a matter of the fish in the fish farms in the ocean being problematic to fish in the ocean, it's actually affecting inland fish as well. Alexander, can you speak a little bit to, what is the risk that is posed to wild salmon from fish farms? And also, is that the only problem that wild salmon are facing? Is it just fish farms and whatever it is that they mean to the wild salmon stocks?
Well, to answer your second question first, they are not the only impact, but the problem is wild salmon are no longer getting to sea because as they pass these farms, which have been clustered on the migration route, they are being infected with levels of sea lice that they're just not used to. So salmon farms are feedlots, and they break all the natural laws that kept wild salmon prosperous on this coast. They hold them in one place. It's monoculture, so they're genetically similar. And the viruses and the sea lice, similar to this picture, are just exploding on these farms. And then the little wild fish go by, and they are getting infected. And they just weren't designed to take this. This is happening in Norway, Scotland, Ireland, Eastern Canada, Chile, everywhere this salmon farming industry operates. And yet, they've been allowed to get away with the myth that they're doing things better here. Well, they're not. 99% of the Fraser sockeye were infected at levels they won't survive last spring, and it's ongoing.
So after we had that discussion in November, huge bombshell just days before Christmas when the federal government said that the fish farms are going to shut down within 18 months. APTN reporter Kathleen Martins has covered this issue. She covered the big Christmas surprise announcement. She joins me now. So, you know, in the fall, DFO basically says, oh, these things are all fine. And then we have the conversation we just had with Bob Chamberlain and Alexandra. Surprise, a couple days before Christmas.
Yeah,
what
Alexandra
happened?
was crying, right? Like I think just the shock and the surprise. And I got a call, you know, a day before. I got a heads up saying, Kathleen, APTN's going to want to cover this. It's going to be good news. And I'm like, well, good news for whom? And they're like, well,
this is from the federal government phoning you to say we got a big announcement.
Yeah, and you know, they're not going to say, well, it's good news for the salmon, but you know, I mean, it's good news for First Nations because they were consulted. These 7 First Nations that were around these specific farms where the licenses came up for renewal.
Yeah,
and that was the decision that was made in December. And those First Nations said, no, we don't want them in the water. We don't want their open net pens. They're like above ground swimming pool type situation, suspended into the ocean, and they grow Atlantic salmon. And you know,
which who thought this was a good idea in the first place, right? How do you take Atlantic salmon, put them in the Pacific Ocean, and say, oh, it's probably fine. It's not going to have any impact on the wild salmon stocks in BC.
And study and scientist after scientist has said no, like it's contributing to this serious decline in Pacific salmon, right? The Fraser River salmon. So, and First Nations were front and center. They've been talking about this for years.
Yeah.
Right? So, and they are not against salmon farming.
No.
They just don't want it in the ocean.
Exactly.
And in their traditional waters. Bring it on land.
Yep.
We'll work with you. We'll partner with you. We want the jobs. We have salmon expertise. We can help you. I mean, this is a multi-million-dollar industry. This is hundreds of jobs.
Yeah.
This decision has hurt those people. It's affected families, communities have been split. So, you know, doesn't mean you can't do it anymore, but just please do it on land. And they think it's going to work, you know, on land. It'll be a renewable resource.
Well, I have to ask, when when this announcement came out and you were going to people to do the story, like, hey, so this announcement came out, I would assume there was shock.
Yes. Bob Chamberlain.
Like, how often when you're First Nation and you've been fighting for something for this long, when does the government ever do the right thing? When do you ever get that phone call, right?
And they didn't have to go to court. Right?
Like,
it's
what
usually
were people saying when you? I mean, I envy you that you got to make those phone calls and I get those responses on.
Yeah, no. Well, you know, I had been prepared, right? Alexandra, Bob, they'd said to me, Kathleen, it's up to First Nations now. Finally, it seems like every other avenue had been exhausted. Maybe the federal government will actually listen to what First Nations have to say, and they did.
Well, and then, you know, you're probably like me, a little bit stunned silent. You know, we're used to covering news in a, like, oh, the government did this and it was wrong, and so we go here, we get this reaction. We're not very used to doing, like, holy, something was done right.
And you just hear, like, crying.
You know, I guess, so what are the First Nations going to do now? They fought the fight, they won. You know, they've been fighting this for so long, now what?
Well, they still welcome the industry. They want to partner with the industry, but they want to have involvement with it. They've got expertise with fish, right?
Yeah.
They're like, bring it onto land, have it like above ground swimming pools, have your pens on land. You can still use the ocean water.
Right.
You can still it'll be like any other kind of fish farm, fish hatchery, but it'll be on land where it won't pollute, the Pacific salmon won't be swimming through the waste and the parasites that are coming off those farms, right, floating in the water.
The visuals that we saw just in that beautiful piece that we had watched before you came on here with from our friends at APTN Investigates, like, and those, like, the deformed, gross fish.
Yeah.
Have you ever eaten farmed fish?
I have, and I don't like it. I don't feel good about it. I don't, you know, I'm glad they have to put the sticker on that says it's farmed.
Yeah.
As a consumer, I want to know. And the other thing is, like, these are the companies that run these fish farms, they're Norwegian, right?
Right.
And so they've been silent since the decision came down. We don't know how they are feeling, what they're going to do. Are they going to continue and do it on land? We don't know. Or leave, yeah, we don't know. And we're not the only country. They had these kinds of you know, water-based farms, which sounds weird, but we're off the coast of Oregon and Washington as well, south of BC. And then they declared like a moratorium on it as well. So it's sort of like, got to get out of the water, get on the land.
Figure it out. Well, thank you for joining us, and we've got lots to watch for, I guess, in 2021 on this file too.
Yep.
Yay. Okay, well, we are all out of time for our very first show of 2021. Thanks for joining us. This episode, of course, is available as a podcast at our website, aptnnews.ca/podcast. If you missed this or any show and you want to catch up, you can always find it there. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Have a great afternoon.